Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Orchestrating Data Transfers in the Digital Era, Navigating Challenges and Solutions for Multi-Environment Data Pipelines. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be moderating today's event. Our featured speaker is Dan Twing, President and COO from Enterprise Management Associates. Dan joined EMA in 2005 and has over 25 years of experience in information systems, software development, and technology outsourcing. Dan focuses on all aspects of intelligent and automated management of IT. While Dan will defer answering your questions until the conclusion of today's event, we encourage you to log your questions anytime using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA with the on-demand playback, as well as more information about this new research report. So I hope you'll check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Dan Twing. Dan?
Thanks, Raleigh. And welcome, everybody. Very excited to talk about the latest findings here on moving data in the modern enterprise. First, let me give you a quick look at some demographics of the folks that we were looking to get information from. This was a global survey. We were in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. We had 264 respondents. You can see that, we were talking primarily to IT executives, about 40%, and then we had folks in various lines of IT operations, and we had in total about 12%, let's call 11% business users in here, maybe closer to 15 if you go beyond just the executives and the business line leaders, and there were a handful of business users as well. And we had some infrastructure engineer and data architects as well. We were looking at organizations over 500 employees. You can see the spread there in terms of numbers of employees. It looks a lot like a lot of the research you've seen me present in the past, similar kinds of audience here for this research. Really, because we had that heavy representation of IT execs, you can see about 45% were technical decision makers, about 14% financial decision makers. So good, I think a good audience for the kinds of questions we were looking for. I'm going to start with what was going to be my final slide, just to emphasize here the importance of moving files. We often talk about the importance of workload automation and a lot of the things that that I cover. And, workload has been adding native capabilities for file transfer. It's also orchestrating other forms of file transfer software. And that's kind of the connection to my research. And I've used a similar slide there. The numbers here are a bit lower, but still significant. Two different questions. The chart on the left here. To what degree do these functional areas rely upon file transfers and moving data? And these are the numbers for a high or very high response on a 5-point type question. No surprise, IT operations is one of the bigger users and app developers. But beyond that, service, sales, supply chain, these organizations are all relying heavily on file transfers and other forms of moving data, as well as the chart on the right, somewhat are very proactive in sponsoring file transfers. And you can see, again, that across the organization, there's a need. And as organizations have become more data-driven, it's not just, the traditional reasons to move data from this subsystem to another to keep processing. But there's a lot more use of data for analytics. There's a lot more sharing of data. Data is, being directed to machine learning models. It's being used to train AI. So it's a very important concept, and getting the data where it needs to go affects a lot of the business. Another big impact has been digital transformation. I've talked a lot about how digital transformation has impacted automation, and it's also impacting how data moves. And then the urgency and the volumes of data that are moving. So we asked this question: how is digital transformation changing the requirements for moving data? You're going to see this theme over and over and over: security, right? If I'm moving data, even when data is at rest, security is a major concern, and digital transformation is not reducing that concern for security. It's actually increasing it. Also, a lot more things are moving to the cloud, and so we have more environments, and that's increasing the need to move data in and among these environments. That's also, you'll see later, where volumes are increasing. But that's the third one here, volume. We're seeing more data moving. We're seeing a need for streaming data or real-time data processing. Data governance issues are rising. So, all of these things are kind of being driven because organizations are trying to digitize their entire operations. And a lot of that is either generating new data, it's generating data in locations where it has to be relocated to be used, and it's creating larger volumes of data. So next, for me, I really wanted to start with a very high-level top-down view of all forms of data. Even though my primary focus was going to be data that moves in files, we're going to start by looking at all types of data. And really, I wanted to look at a couple of things, both the different timing as well as the different environments, and then the individual software or types of software that's used. So looking first at just timing of data movement, and I have the next three charts are going to look like this. So the chart on the left is the means of moving it and which enterprises are using those means or mechanisms. The chart on the right then is the amount of data moved by that method. So scheduled data is the most common form of data movement. 78% of enterprises have at least one form of scheduled data. This ties back to workload automation because that's where the schedule is, right? For the most part. But 72% of enterprises also have real-time data integration. So they're almost neck and neck, and real-time continues to increase. And then there are various means of event-driven data movement. And we see that 57% of enterprises have some form or multiple forms of event-driven. Near real-time is also significant at about 48%. And ad hoc or on-demand or spontaneous sharing, that's really going to be end-user driven. So either they can pull it when they want it, or they're sharing it, one user to another across desktops. And about 48% of organizations have those needs as well. When we look at the volume of data, scheduled data is about 25% of all data that's moved. Real-time data integration is, again, just a step behind that at about 23%. And you can kind of see how that steps down from there. So while near real-time is in less organizations, you can see that it's actually got more data volume in near real-time than event-driven, which is used in more enterprises, but doesn't do nearly the volume of the near real-time data. Now we can take a look at where is this data coming from. And you can see the left side is in use at enterprises and the right side is the volume of data. So private cloud is generating the most data, or at least the most enterprises are generating data out of private cloud. 73% have a private cloud running. Just because you have a SaaS app doesn't mean you don't need to move data to and from it, right? In fact, as SaaS has taken off in a number of areas, in service management and other categories of software and CRMs, there's a huge need to use that data, to move data to it, to move data from it. Public cloud, also 58% of organizations have data coming and going from public clouds. On-prem user devices, mainframes is interesting because it's only in 38% of organizations have data coming to and from a mainframe. However, look onto the right side here, mainframe is about still close to 15% of all the data. So it's the third highest in terms of volume of data, even though, you know, it's much farther down the list in terms of enterprises that still operate mainframes. But the ones that are high volume, and they're still moving a lot of data out of those mainframe environments or into them, depending, you know, it's still bi-directional depending on the use case. And then, you know, the third-party hosted is, again, the lowest, but user devices are not using moving as much data. So, you know, there's still more data moving from those fewer third-party hosted environments as well. Then if we get into the actual means of moving it in between these environments, and this is sort of a laundry list of all the ways you might move data from files at the top, which is still the most common method. 58% of orgs are still moving data by files. And then, you know, there's secure file sharing and collaboration tools. Enterprise resource planning systems often have their own ways of sharing data. API management has come up pretty significantly. So you can see all those various ways, including middleware and message queue systems near the bottom there, and enterprise service buses. You know, some of these are involved in the near real time and the streaming means to move data, as well as API management is also a common way for data to move in real time. So, you know, I kind of took a holistic view, and you'll see the order of that list change a bit when we look at the volumes of data on the right side here. So, you know, managed file transfer software, even though it's being used here by 38% of orgs, it's moving almost 11% of the data. Tends to be used a lot for the higher volume data movement, or where encryption is very important. iPaaS, or integration platform as a service, again, you can see on the left side there, 42% of organizations have an iPaaS, but iPaaS is moving about 10% of all data right now. Workload automation with the native managed file transfer is also moving about 10%. So you can see that workload automation is moving almost as much data natively as managed file transfer software is moving, or as iPaaS is moving. And then there are other secure and file transfer means and collaboration tools, you know, like Zoom, which we're using right now. People can put things in chats, and there's different ways to share that data, or in network file stores and whatnot. File transfer protocol servers, quite popular, but on the decline, you'll see as we move further into this data, but still moving a significant amount of data at 9%. You know, you can, as you get into some of the more technical and real-time means, they're lower on the list, but very important. They're moving less data, but they're moving very important data for their use cases. So now we'll drill into files specifically. So I wasn't intending to spend a lot of time on some of those other means, and really looking at the file movement specifically. So these are the same numbers we saw before, just recalculated for just the shorter list of things here. So when you look just at files, that managed file transfer software is carrying about 18% of the workload. iPaaS and workload automation are just a step behind that. The interesting thing is we see a lot of in-house developed scripts and applications. And when we get farther into the presentation, there'll be a surprise around these in-house scripts are actually increasing in number. Which may just be a manifestation of, you know, being in transition between different technologies, being in transition with how AI is coming online in different organizations. But we're seeing actually a rise in that. So it's 16% almost now. That's actually increasing. in terms of just the sheer volume of transfers, the majority of the respondents answered, you can see 28% in that 1,000 to 5,000 files a week range. If you took this whole chart here and looked at the weighted average across that, kind of using the midpoints of each of those ranges, you could say that the average organization is moving about 14,000 files a week. So the volumes are pretty significant. And when we look at, we ask, how are they changing? Nobody says they're declining. About 17% are stable, and the rest are increasing, with the bulk, kind of at the higher end there. I mean, 10 to 25% increase. We see 34% are living in that realm. And you might ask, well, why are we moving so much more data? Again, I think, first of all, just the sheer number of environments. I mean, everything that's happened in the cloud is awesome, but you now have 12 or 14 locations where you might have had one or two when you were running on-prem, depending on how you deployed that cloud. Or you might have stripped 3 or 4 key functions off to SaaS apps, but you're still running some stuff on-prem, and you've maybe spun up your own stuff in the cloud. So we've spread the infrastructure out. Even without growth in transaction volumes and everything else, the more we've spread the infrastructure out, the more there is a need to just move data between those locations. It's all still inside the enterprise, but it needs to get where the processing is being done. And the cloud has actually, in sort of a backwards way, increased the amount of data that moves, just to move it in and amongst the various locations where these subsystems live in the cloud. On top of that, we have an increase in data use and analytics and machine learning. So a lot of data that maybe existed before has new use cases and new destinations to go to. So there is an overall rise in volume of things, but the actual increase in data movement, I think, has more to do with some structural choices and the way we use the data than sheer increase in overall volume. We're just making more copies, and we're moving it to more places and using it in more ways. 57% of organizations are sending files internationally. Interesting data point. Ask the question. I'm not really sure what more to do with that. I mean, it does have some regulatory considerations, and it certainly has, in some areas, there's regulatory issues on terms of where that data can be housed. So certainly for the majority of organizations, that is a concern. When we look at the features that folks feel are important if they're looking at data movement software, specifically moving files, here again, security is at the top of that list, and significantly so. So 59% find that security protocols is a big part of their feature ask when they're looking at these tools. And when you see people switching, or when, in a moment, I'll talk about the challenges of these different tools. Security is near the top on all of them. Integration capabilities with existing systems, also a key aspect. So, we see that across the board, whether you're talking managed file transfer software, whether it's an iPaaS capability, whether you're moving data with native capabilities inside of a workload automation tool. The integrations that exist to share that data or get that data in the right format are a big part often of thinking about that problem overall. Availability, disaster recovery, high on the list, no surprise there. So, there's your top 3. And then scalability, of course, is a concern. And, even though security protocols were an issue, encryption is high on that list as well, in the top 5. So security will continue to come up, but these are the things folks are thinking about as they think about which tool am I going to use to move this, and should I be changing software? Also, automation is a big part of moving data. And I was particularly interested in the role that workload automation is playing, and as orchestration becomes more of a factor in workload automation, how are we relating that to the need to move data around? So first off, the most used method is to actually take advantage of the native managed file transfer capabilities that have been built up over the last few years in workload software. So 24% of enterprises are leaning heavily into those native capabilities. They're also using workload. 22% are using it to orchestrate other data pipeline activities. They're also using it to orchestrate, the managed file transfer software. So it's involved in that huge amount of data that's moved on a schedule. Workload has its role even when it's not actually the software moving the data, whether that's orchestrating managed file transfer software or orchestrating file transfer protocol servers. And you have 20% of enterprises who just aren't using WLA at all in their file transfer activities. They may be getting by with an iPaaS and they just don't have a need for further activity there. Since security is such a big topic, we asked a couple of questions on how securing file transfers. First of all, less than half of file transfers are encrypted. So on the inbound side, we see 47% are encrypted. On when data is at rest, and this is kind of key, because is it at rest just in its final destination? We saw about 18 months ago a number of big breaches around the data at rest with certain managed file transfer software, where it was sort of at rest, sort of while it was in transit, and it was in the clear, and there were some big breaches because of some of those gaps. And we see just 41% of data is encrypted while at rest. And the trade-off, of course, is there's a lot of overhead in having to decrypt it when you want to use it. So it's a real trade-off, and you can kind of see that people are making that trade-off very carefully. On the outbound side, we see about 49% of data is encrypted. The encryption methods are a big concern, and one of the challenges is around key management, and that has a lot to do with why some folks will switch maybe from a file transfer protocol server or FTPS to a managed file transfer software. Is those tools often have more support around the file transfer encryption key management. So yeah, we see that SFTP and FTP are the most commonly used, and then you can kind of see some of the other methods from there. And then the encryption methods for data at rest, the cloud storage encryption being the most popular, and then encrypted in database. Again, those sound a lot more like final destinations. You kind of do have to watch where you might be temporarily holding data midstream in the transfer process, because that has absolutely been an area of concern recently. So that's where you can get down to, are you encrypting those file level? Only 39% are doing it at the file level. And they may not, you have to ask, is it happening end to end or not? So file transfer challenges, when we're looking just there, this chart combines the four primary methods that I was looking at here, and I asked these individually. What is your satisfaction on each of these, depending on how you happen to use them? So iPaaS has become very popular. If you don't know, integration platform as a service is sort of, there are sort of two types. There are those that are meant to be more of a general or generic hub for data transfer. And then there are those that are very specific to a use case. So you might have iPaaS is part of an ETL or an ELT if you're depending on how you're handling data pipelines these days. So there are some that are very specific, maybe targeted to a specific function or application. And then there are others that are more generic. And some of them can be quite sophisticated, and some of them can use the actual means to move the data can be a managed file transfer software. It could still be an FTP server, but it has this sort of integration capability. It's in the cloud, it's as a service. It's really, I think, great for when you're have a bunch of users pulling files down or a bunch of users sending files in to a specific application. The satisfaction is the highest with iPaaS at 96%. That's combining the satisfied and very satisfied scores. The workload automation software, when it's used with its native file transfer capabilities, is the next highest ranked on satisfaction at 93%. The use cases here seem to be predominantly high volume of transfers, but not a high volume of data. So a lot of smaller transfers or medium-sized transfers, a lot of where the scheduling is key. It just seems to be real easy for folks to take advantage of those capabilities in their workload automation software. Again, with managed file transfer software specifically, still very high score, 91% on satisfaction. Tends to be used more with the key management as a factor, or the really high volume. These tools can be tuned. Some of them do high volume much better. Might also be a use case around EDI. A lot of the managed file transfer software vendors have added other things like API management, and they're looking at more of a holistic data movement capability. And then there are others who are very specific around mid-sized use cases, but better than an FTP server because they incorporate key management. And the FTP server is sort of the bottom rung here, but still 90% are satisfied or very satisfied. Biggest reasons usually for leaving an FTP server is key management challenges. And they'll step up to a managed file transfer. So here I've combined the top challenges for each of those 4 methods, just so you can kind of see them together here. Now, there were a lot more options. We asked to pick the top 3, and I'm showing the 5 for each of these that had the highest responses. So when you look at the managed file transfer category, that's the chart on the top left. Security concerns are top the list, and then licensing challenges and costs, and then the complexity of workflows are the 3 highest ones there. Integration and compatibility and file size and formats are also challenges. You go down to below that, the FTP servers, security tops the list there again, and it jumps way out past everything else. That's predominantly around key management. And even though MFT software is really where they go to solve that part of the security challenge, security is still the top of the list on managed file transfer. Monitoring and visibility is a challenge with FTP servers. They're pretty basic in how they function. You get better monitoring and visibility out of a managed file transfer software. If you're not familiar with them, many of them are very much like a microcosm of a workload automation software. They have the same concept of a job and a job stream and event triggers and calendars. And those 2 classes of software have a lot in common. The managed file transfer is focused on a very specific use case, tends to have more structure around the encryption and key management capabilities, but certainly it has more monitoring and visibility than an FTP server. We see the same thing with integration and compatibility being a challenge, and then cost and licensing, and then file size and formats. So very similar to MFT software in terms of its concerns, but you can see that MFT sort of has the edge on the security, even though it remains a concern. We switch to the other side of the chart. On the top right, the workload software that has native file transfer capabilities contained in it. Scalability is at the top of the list, which kind of caught me off guard because generally speaking, I think of workload automation software as being, one that scales very well, and they all certainly have to around the numbers of jobs that they're orchestrating. But when it comes to moving files, I think that while they have good capabilities, and you certainly, if you have a lot of smaller file transfers with a lot of scheduling or event trigger complexity around it, this is a great answer. But if you just have a sheer high volume of data to move, the specialized managed file transfer software might edge this out in some of those use cases. Regulatory compliance, another concern here. If some of those compliance factors might be built into a managed file transfer tool, they might not be in a workload tool. So you have to think about it yourself and address it. Security is certainly never going to leave the list. It ranks a bit lower here than in some of the other software types. And still, integration and compatibility is a factor. Workload's not doing much to solve that. And a lot of the tools, mobile and remote access isn't as pervasive maybe in the workload software as it might be in some of these other tools. And then iPaaS, which had a very high satisfaction rating. I found this very interesting, that iPaaS, the first letter in it, integration, while integration and compatibility is the top challenge for iPaaS software. So even though it simplifies things, it gives you this sort of destination to either go pull files or place files in, and it's a little better maybe for self-help or self-service by whoever's sending or pulling those files. The integration is better. The software is designed for that. It still remains a big challenge for people. So I just find it interesting that is the biggest challenge in a category of software that was really intended to solve the integration problems. And it does. It absolutely does. And yet those challenges are still topping the list. And then, our old friend security, still high on the list there. Cost is a factor, of course. And again, the iPaaS, it can have more regulatory compliance built in when it's done for a very specific use case. But if you buy one that's more oriented at just being more of a general hub, they don't tend to have that specialized capability, and therefore regulatory compliance could be more of a challenge in that type of a product. And because it's more of a self-help situation, user adoption and training is a factor in iPaaS. We don't see that with the other ones. So sticking on the topic of iPaaS for just a moment, we asked, do you have plans to expand iPaaS usage or explore alternative integration solutions? Because it has that high satisfaction at 96%, it shouldn't be a surprise that for 45% of these organizations that are already using iPaaS, they intend to use it more. 17% said, no, I'm all set. Another 17% are looking at alternatives. So, some of those challenges might be big enough that they're looking beyond iPaaS. And, iPaaS it can be scheduled, it can be ad hoc, it can be, it can even, in some cases be streaming oriented, but usually if you're going to go to near real time or real time, you're probably doing something else. And I wouldn't be surprised if the 17% looking for alternative solutions the use case is probably changing, and that's why they're looking in that direction. 13% don't have iPaaS but are planning to add it, and 9% don't know what they're doing. But you can see that iPaaS is very popular. Although when we look to the future here in a couple of slides, we may be seeing the peak of iPaaS's popularity. So then we asked, are you thinking of making a change to how you're moving files? 14% are actively looking at other mechanisms. We talked about a lot of different means here. So, I didn't drill into the detail of what they're on and where they're heading. Another 17%, yeah, I'm going to look in the next 12 months. Another 13%, I'm going to look in the next 12 to 24. Point is, use cases are evolving. New AI training needs are rising. New machine learning needs need new data. It's not a surprise with how active people are at creating new data, creating new environments, creating new digital transformations, that their data moving needs are changing, and therefore the tools they use are under review. And we have another 18% that are actively looking right now, probably for many of those reasons. But you got a third of the market who's standing pat right now. We're all good. I think this might be one of the most impactful slides here. And we're going to spend a little bit of time really taking this one apart. And then we're going to talk a little bit about data ops. So earlier, I presented that first slide where we asked about all forms of data movement. So now we're kind of broadening out again beyond just file transfer software, and we're looking at all of those different means. The blue bar is the data we already saw, which was collected, in that first question. How are you using, and here we're looking at the distribution, not the number of enterprises using it, but the volumes of data. So if you remember, when we looked at this chart before, that was the right side of the chart, how much data is moving through that mechanism. The green bar here is, I asked them to forecast, what do you think it looks like in 2027? So I asked this late in the survey. So up front, I asked them, how are you currently moving data? And then after all these other questions we asked them, very near the end, we said, so what do you think that looks like 3 years from now? And that's what the green bar is telling us. So right at the top, the most common form currently, that 13.4% of data, is that file transfer protocol server. And yet that's forecast to only be 9% 3 years from now. So clearly people are walking away from file transfer protocol servers in favor of other means of moving, at least in this case, file-based data. iPaaS actually shows a slight decline, which I found quite interesting. I mean, that might not be statistically significant, but it's certainly not continuing to grow. So I think while iPaaS is very popular, very well liked, and it suits certain use cases very, very well, it seems like it might be sort of peaking at this point. It might be near the top of its use. There's certainly others that are coming to it who haven't been there yet, but there's current users who, at least we saw 18% are kind of looking around. There are use cases that might drive them to something like more near real time. And that may be why some of the more progressive use cases are going to pull volume away from iPaaS. Secure file sharing and collaboration tools also relatively flat to a slight decline there. And again, that may be because the use case is shifting and there's other capabilities that are better suited. Automated workflow and business process automation tools, again, kind of flat, maybe a slight decline. What's increasing, interestingly enough, is managed file transfer sees a bit of a jump there, as does the native capabilities in workload see quite a jump, by probably one of the bigger jumps on here, by about 2%. ERP systems pretty flat in their expectations. API management platforms will increase. That's not surprising. When I first started hearing about API management, I was thinking it was a lot more about key management, because if you've had to deal with any of these sort of integrations, you know that security is a factor there. And a lot of times, you need a key for your API to talk to, the other system whose API you're coded to. And so my view of API management was the key management side of it, and that is a big part of it. But there's a lot of data moving through APIs now. It is one of the more common means of near real-time or real-time data movement. It's on a record level or a transaction level, not on a file level, but you throughout the course of the day, there's a high volume of data moving, one record, one transaction at a time, sub-second, thousands of them, over the course of several minutes. That volume of data is significant. It's just it's not sitting there to move once at the end of the day in a big file. It's moving, little pieces throughout the day. Same with what might be moving through an enterprise service bus or through a message queue. All three of which show slight increases expected over the next 3 years. But as I hinted at the beginning of the presentation, one of the biggest jumps here is in-house developed scripts or applications. That's 2.5%, 3% almost. That's jumping up in-house developed scripts, which, we're always seem to be fighting. Let's get rid of silos. Let's get rid of that. We never seem to. And the reason is, I think that what's old and well grooved and matured, we tend to wash the scripts out and we tend to standardize. But when we're breaking new ground, we tend to do a lot of custom things. And we're still breaking a lot of ground in multi-cloud and hybrid cloud environments. We're breaking ground with machine learning. We're absolutely breaking ground in AI usage, both in terms of how can these tools benefit from Gen AI, but also what is their role in providing data to train Gen AI models for use, both in the business use cases and in IT use cases. So I think there's so many new things happening around data that there's an awful lot of these in-house scripts or custom apps that are getting developed to close those gaps. 5 years from now, somebody, it might not be me, somebody will be talking about what happens with all of these scripts we created back at the beginning of Gen AI and machine learning. And, as tools mature, we'll start to wash those out of the environments and things will become a little more standardized. But right now, that is an area where we're seeing growth where we would usually be trying to stomp out that kind of activity. I think there's a lot of innovation happening, and that is something that's not going to go away anytime soon. So from there, let's take a little look at data ops and data pipelines. Data ops has grown in popularity and adoption since the term was coined in 2014, right? So we've been talking about this concept for about 10 years. Interestingly enough, that's just a few years after we started talking about digital transformation. So, I think there's a link there that says, we really need to bring, and of course, we've been talking about DevOps even before that. And, how do we bring more structure around data ops? And data ops is I'm no expert on that. The folks that are in business intelligence, there's a lot more business side around data ops than I'm going to cover. But within data ops, we have the concept of the data pipeline, which affects a lot of what we've been talking about here. So just generally looking at, where is the market at in terms of adopting data ops, you can see that just 33%, the folks on the far right here, feel that they're fully implemented and integrated with data ops in their environment. So about a third of the market is mature. Another 46%, almost half, are well on their way to having implemented data ops and having, the kinds of integrations that come along with that. But they're still kind of underway. 20% are really just getting started at looking at this. And there's about 1% who aren't going to do it, don't have a need. So you know, 80% of the market is you know, really heavily doing this, with 20% bringing up the rear. When we then, you know, shift the topic from data ops to the data pipeline, how do we actually, you know, the moving the data part of data ops, because there's, you know, it's much broader concept than just moving the data. It's curating the data, cleaning the data, you know, standardizing the data, normalizing the data. So there's a lot of things around it. But the data pipeline fits this, what we've been talking about. It's right in the sweet spot of how do you get the data from where it, you know, originates to where it needs to be used. And in this case, we asked the question, you know, are data pipelines utilized within your organization? 49% say, yeah, I'm widely adopted on the concept of data pipelines. Specific use cases, another 43% are heavy on data pipelines just for specific use cases. And the rest of the market is about 7-8%, not really, you know, either, you know, that 1%, they don't use that term at all, and 7% aren't doing much with it. So the next logical question then is, you know, what are your challenges around orchestrating these data pipelines? Because we know that some of the very tools we've been talking about are involved in that data pipeline. I mean, it's sort of when you talk about moving data through files, different file transfer mechanisms, or the other means like the streaming and whatnot, any of that could be involved in a data pipeline. And so security and compliance concerns, as we've said many times through this presentation, security is always the top of the list. Scalability and performance right behind that. Integration and complexity. Compatibility with legacy technologies, and just cost and resource constraints. So, you know, these challenges don't look all that different than the different means of moving data that we've already talked about, and those challenges. So a data pipeline concept and you know, deploying data ops certainly helps with these issues, but they don't just magically go away either. They are challenging, and they continue to be challenging even when you're using the right processes and the right tools. But automation does improve data pipelines. And when we ask how, you know, has the implementation of automation and orchestration improved your organization's data pipeline processes, 61% said it's increased efficiency and productivity. Another 53% said it improved reliability and reduced errors. 49% found that it enhanced their scalability and performance. They also have provided visibility and monitoring capabilities for the whole pipeline. So some of those challenges are absolutely mitigated through automation, and the primary means of automation here, and if you're involved at all in workload automation and orchestration, you certainly know that data pipelines has probably in the last 5 or 6 years been one of the big rising use cases in that space, because that concept of data ops and the need to have a data pipeline is definitely benefited through the right use of automation. And I think you can see here why. So really asking, so where are you at in the maturity of using automation with your data pipelines? We have, you know, about 41% that are fully automated. So less than half, but you know, we're approaching, we're well past a third. We're on our way to maybe getting close to half the market. But certainly the majority right now, not as automated as they could be or would like to be. So 51% partially automated with room for improvement, and about 6% are very, you know, sort of dominated still with manual processes. You know, there's no doubt that automation and data pipelines and the concept of data ops really do go hand in hand. And this is clearly an area that, you know, we've been moving files for a long time in IT. It's not getting less important. There are more ways to move it than just files. Those are becoming more important. The The timelines are shrinking to near real time, and a lot of data is streaming now. But the idea of that linkage between automation and orchestration and moving data, it's a heavy linkage. It's important, and there's plenty of room to improve it. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Raleigh and open us up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Dan. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, the report is now available. I will be sending the link to learn more in the follow-up email, so check that email out. And now I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions. Dan, the first one is, why do you think WLA native MFT has scalability challenges?
Well, we talked about that a little bit during the presentation, but it was kind of a surprise to me. So I'm glad that somebody wanted to discuss this a little more. I talked to several product managers in the workload space to see. I mean, I of course, when I do the radar, I talk to a lot of end users, and I talk to a lot of end users just all the time. But on this topic, I also went and asked a few folks, in the product roles, why they thought we got that data point. And the answer that came back was, where we see people using a lot of the native file transfer is not in the really, really high volume areas. It's high numbers of transfers, especially where they're, scheduling or a certain type of event trigger. And you have a lot of smaller files to move to a lot of endpoints. That kind of scalability seems to be the sweet spot for the workload tools and their native file transfer features. But if you're talking about big files and lots of them, there is a point where you want to go to the specialized software. And as you can see, we had about 10% of all data moving through managed file transfer, and about 9.1, 9.2, if I remember that chart correctly, using the native capability. So they're almost neck and neck with each other, but they have their sweet spots. And the managed file transfer sweet spot, that core kind of software, tends to be either the heavily encrypted or the really high volume. The workload then takes the next tier of volume, the lots of endpoints, but maybe not the amount of data, but the workflow, the scheduling capabilities, the monitoring and visibility you get with workload all benefit that kind of transfer use case. And that's why we see a heavy use there, but not the highly scaling situations.
Thanks for those insights, Dan. The next question is iPaaS replacing FTP and MFT?
I think if I had done this survey 3-4 years ago, we probably would have seen a lot more FTP and a lot less iPaaS, for example. I think iPaaS absolutely has pulled a lot of volume away for again, it seems to have utility in certain use cases. I didn't include there were some questions in the survey that I did not include here. There always are a bunch that I just don't have time for. But I did have 2 questions where I asked if you were creating a new inbound file transfer, or the other question, if you were creating a new outbound file transfer, which software would you choose to do that? On the inbound side, iPaaS was favored. On the outbound side, it was neck and neck between, I believe, native features in workload and iPaaS. So yeah, I think iPaaS is pulling a bit of the more either highly focused use cases away from FTP, and maybe just a little bit away from managed file transfer. But also you saw that it's really forecasted not to get much bigger based on this group of respondents when I asked them what they think they're going to have, their mix will be in 3 years in 2027. So I think it did pull away, but I think it might be peaking. And iPaaS is great. It has a great role. It's highly loved. People are going to use it more for certain things. but it's also starting to shed some volume, I think, to the near real time and real time mechanisms, depending again on the use case. So iPaaS is going to be around. It's important. It's probably going to continue to eke some volume away from certainly FTP, maybe some others. But I don't think it's, in 3 or 5 years, it's going to double in size. I mean, what these folks told us is they're probably using it about as much as they're gonna.
Thanks, Dan. Let's take one final question before we wrap up. It is, why are file transfer volumes increasing?
Yeah, I probably hit that a bit along the way, but for me, I mean, there's always a sort of an increase in, companies are growing, the population is growing, more people adopt different technological use cases, maybe than they used in the past. So there's always like an increase in volumes, but I don't believe that is the main driver here. Yes, the total amount of data is going up, and there's more activity to account for in that data. But I think we're just using it more and in more places, and we're generating it in more locations now. So the hybrid cloud explosion, a function that maybe used to live on a mainframe only, or a mainframe and an on-prem system, might now have parts of itself containerized in the cloud. Some core pieces might still be on the mainframe. You might now have an end-to-end process that used to live on 1 or 2 environments that lives in 7 environments. So maybe the transaction volume around that system increased by 10%, but all of a sudden I might be moving 40% of that data between and amongst all those different environments, depending. And I think a lot of as we transition where we have these things housed, we're actually creating more need to move the same data around. Certainly, we're logging more things. We have more analytic tools to search those logs. We're saving data to train AI models. We have machine learning models running that have to be monitored for, so they don't wander. They have to be, retested and tweaked over time. So there's just a lot more destinations to use the data, and there's a lot more source systems generating the data. So we might have a 10% increase in volume, but we might have a doubling in the amount of data we're moving around if you kind of looked over the last, say, 10 years. So I think the volumes are increasing mostly because we're doing more with it from more locations.
Thanks for all those great insights, Dan. And I wanted to thank the audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Please check out the email that you will receive, and I hope we'll see you at a future EMA research webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.